every so often you read a book that makes you stop and think, wait, how did the author know that? For me, that happened with a manga called Spacewalking with You. Now, I'm not going to tell you this is the greatest ADHD or autism representation ever written. I honestly don't know if that's true. What I can tell you is that this is the first manga I've ever read that made me feel understood. And not because it uses the right labels, but because it understands what it's like to struggle before anyone, including yourself, has the words to explain why. I think it's one of the most compassionate manga I've read in years, maybe ever. So what is it? Spacewalking with You is a slice-of-life manga by Inuhiko Doronoda, set in an intentionally vague version of mid-2000s Japan. The story follows Yamato Kobayashi, a high school student who's basically given up. Everyone, including Kobayashi himself, has decided he's lazy. He stopped trying because failing after trying hurts a lot more than failing because he never cared in the first place. It's easier to look lazy than look dumb. Then one day, a transfer student named Uno arrives. And Uno is different. He's loud, painfully honest. He carries around this battered notebook everywhere he goes. And instead of laughing at him, Kobayashi becomes fascinated. And that's where the story really begins. Not with a big dramatic reveal, just one teenager becoming curious about another. There's a scene fairly early on where Uno pulls out that notebook, and it's full of reminders, things most people would probably call common sense. Definitely things that a high school student shouldn't need reminding to do. And Kobayashi's best friend Saku bullies Uno for exactly that fact. But Kobayashi is intrigued and returns the notebook to Uno after Saku throws it away. That tiny moment completely changes Uno's opinion of Kobayashi. For Uno, this isn't some scary-looking slacker anymore. That's when Kobayashi becomes his friend. And the same thing happened with Kobayashi, where Uno gets him out of a jam precisely because he is very loud and says exactly what's on his mind when he thinks it. But as their friendship deepens, Kobayashi starts to notice how Uno approaches problems, how he asks questions, how he keeps track of things, how he isn't embarrassed to use tools that help him succeed, how to ask people for help when he clearly needs it. For maybe the first time in his life, Kobayashi starts wondering, maybe I'm not stupid, maybe I just need help. When Doronoda was asked why she set the story in the early 2000s, she said she kept asking herself, what did we know back then? And what were we still unaware of? That one idea explains almost everything about this manga. Nobody talks about ADHD or autism. Nobody has the vocabulary. Instead, people call Kobayashi lazy. People think Uno is strange. The characters don't understand themselves yet. And that's exactly what growing up felt like for a lot of people around my age. I was diagnosed with ADHD as a kid, but having a diagnosis didn't magically mean myself or anyone understood what was going on. Even schools were unsure of what even all to do and mostly concerned with me affecting anyone else's learning. And whether they knew about my ADHD diagnosis or not, most teachers just thought I wasn't trying hard enough. I was lazy. I was not living up to potential. That's why this manga hit me so hard. It doesn't just represent neurodivergence. It captures what it feels like before you understand your own brain. There's so many people nowadays that are unsure about how they're experiencing the world and maybe going around without a formal diagnosis, but still wondering, yeah, maybe this sort of stuff makes sense. Maybe this explains a lot of what's going on with it. And one thing I love about the series is that it never feels interested in reducing its characters to a diagnosis. Instead, it keeps asking a much more interesting question. What happens when we stop making assumptions about people? Instead of seeing Uno as weird, Kobayashi gets curious. Instead of deciding Kobayashi is hopeless, people slowly begin asking how they can help him succeed. After his interactions with Uno, Kobayashi decides to get up the courage and ask for help at his part-time job. And that sort of initiative of getting past the fear of people thinking he's dumb actually spurred his boss on to create a training manual for everyone at work so that everyone could have reminders of how to close out a register or put what merchandise where in the store. I think this might actually be from volume 2, but definitely no spoilers. There's a point where it becomes clear that Kobayashi really needs to wear glasses, but he just doesn't for some reason. And I think that was the biggest, like everything about this series up to that point was amazing too. But that was definitely the point where I knew Doronoda knew what she was talking about. For whatever reason, maybe it was just trying to be cool. I didn't wear glasses, even though I very, very badly need glasses in high school for seemingly no reason now that I look back on it. Yeah, this series, these aren't big anime moments. They're nobody's saving the world. Nobody's doing anything crazy. They're just tiny acts of kindness between people that seem to understand each other on a completely different wavelength. One of my favorite examples comes later when Uno is overwhelmed by Kobayashi and another character suddenly shouting at each other. The manga doesn't stop to explain this is what sensory overload is like, and for people with ADHD and autism, sometimes very sudden loud noises can physically hurt, like you're being electrocuted. And because it's manga, Doronoda can communicate that experience visually in a way that's almost impossible to describe with words. I've tried and people don't seem to understand. And that's what really impressed me the most. This manga trusts the reader to internalize things they might not understand. So now, why do I want people to read this so much? I think different readers are going to find different things here. If you're neurodivergent, maybe you'll recognize parts of yourself. Maybe you'll think about things that you aren't necessarily diagnosed with. Maybe you want to go talk to somebody about it. If you're a parent, maybe you'll recognize your child. A teacher, maybe you'll recognize a student that might be acting up. And if none of those apply, maybe it'll just remind you to give some people a second chance. And maybe there's some other reason why they're so very annoying. Because I don't think this story is ultimately about ADHD or autism. I think it's about curiosity, about deciding that the person everyone else has written off might have a story you haven't heard yet. And I love this story, and I think you should go read it, but it is not perfect. Some of Kobayashi's coworkers blur together a little bit, and I occasionally found myself mixing up who was who. And I guess you could say from Kobayashi's point of view, everybody at his work is just this source of stress and anxiety, and he's not even consciously aware of all his coworkers as fully formed people. But that's really my biggest complaint. Otherwise, it's an incredibly gentle, thoughtful slice of life manga. There's a line early in the story that stuck with me. Uno's older sister says to Kobayashi, "Sometimes people just need a little something extra so they can live like everyone else." I think that's one of the most compassionate descriptions of neurodivergence I've ever read, because it's not trying to define anyone. It starts with empathy instead of judgment. Reading Spacewalking with you didn't change my past. It didn't make school any easier. It didn't erase years of believing I was lazy or not living up to my potential. What it did do was make me feel like someone finally understood what that experience has been like. And if a quiet little manga can do that for me, maybe it'll do something for you too. If you've already read Spacewalking with you, I'd love to know what you thought. And if you have another manga that made you feel truly understood, I'd love an excuse to read it. The English release is currently up to 3 volumes. The 3rd volume just released in July, but there's 6 volumes in Japan. And if you're reading in Japanese, it's around an intermediate level, roughly N3, with lots of everyday conversation. But yeah, I've tried to keep this as spoiler-free as possible because I genuinely hope you pick up volume 1 and experience it for yourself. But thank you for hanging out with me, and I hope you have a great day.